Hello, Bob Wells here, and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into the hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. Today, though, rather than diving, we're going to be talking about walking with my guest, Jack Cornish. Jack is head of paths at the Ramblers Association, Britain's largest walking charity. In 2017, he walked across the country from Land's End to John O'Groats, and he's dedicated the last 7 years of his life to walking and recording the forgotten routes of England and Wales. And he's just brought out his latest book, The Lost Paths, a history of how we walk from here to there. Hi, Jack, and welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much for having me today. I'm looking forward to it.
Before we talk about the footpaths themselves and the Ramblers, could you just tell us a little bit about your life's journey and how you became involved with the Ramblers and, you know, what developed your interest in walking and footpaths?
Sure. So I grew up in southeast London, where I still live today, and I didn't particularly grow up in a family where we went for big holidays in the Lake District or long country walks. But my real passion for walking started in the city, and it was exploring sort of more parts of the city where I'd lived my whole life. But really, my journey, I suppose, with the Lost Paths and with sort of uncovering the history of our path network started in 2017. I'd been working in the NHS in a very different career than I have now, and in one of the many reorganisations of the NHS, I decided to take voluntary redundancy, and I wanted to do something with that sort of time that allowed me, and so I decided to walk from Land's End to John O'Groats, not even necessarily the most direct route, but a sort of wiggling line across the country. And it was really on that walk that I think I was expecting to discover some amazing landscapes I'd never, visited before, see some, sort of beautiful nature, and maybe see some of the sort of historic buildings and things like that across the country. But what I think I wasn't expecting, but what happened during the walk is that I sort of fell in love with the infrastructure in a way that I was walking along, those sort of that network of footpaths that goes from one village to the next village, from town to town, city to city, that is sort of, I think, sort of hidden in plain sight in a way. So it was really that amazing network of paths that I fell in love with. And then having finished the walk 1,550 miles later, I saw, when I was looking for jobs afterwards, I saw a role at the Ramblers, and that sort of felt particularly, it was particularly perfect time, really. Having done that walk and sort of fallen in love with those paths, I then came and joined and started working at the Ramblers from there. So that's really where this whole journey started.
It's a fascinating journey. And how long because I've cycled the Land's End John O'Groats cycle, and that took me, I think it was about 14 or 15 days, and that was hard work. How long did the walk take?
So, I did, it was 100 days of actual walking, with obviously some like rest days in between. So it was sort of over a whole summer, really. But I mean, as I said, I didn't, there's a sort of usual Land's End John O'Groats walking route that sort of uses, some of the amazing national trails that we've got. I think it's about 850 miles, something like that, when you walk it. But because there were so many places I hadn't visited in the country, I basically did loads of research beforehand about just interesting things to see in the country and in the landscape. So I ended up doing 1,500 miles, so sort of not too far off double the usual route, because I was sort of wiggling around the country. And but also what that meant is that I wasn't on those national trails for most of the time. I was sort of on those sort of ordinary paths, really, that are sort of maybe less well trodden, and it was an amazing experience.
Yeah, and I guess that would have obviously, as you said, it sparked your interest in footpaths, but you must have there must have been some sort of epiphany where you sort of thought, actually, we've got to protect these paths. Did that happen as well? Yeah.
I mean, definitely. Like, I definitely came across particular paths that had been blocked, either through sort of maybe just lack of usage. People hadn't walked that way for some time, and so the paths had become overgrown and sort of had been sort of almost absorbed back into the landscape and into the into the sort of fauna and flora around. But also, even then, and this is sort of maybe, before I sort of really understood some of the sort of forces at work and the reasons why. But even then, I was sort of looking at my Ordnance Survey map and sort of thinking, well, why is this parish got loads of footpaths that I can use? I've got loads of different options for, to get from A to B and on my journey for that day. But why does the next parish have hardly any? Or why the whole parts of the country that have this massively extensive footpath network, but other places are much sort of sparser? So even then, I think it was sort of those, even though I didn't maybe quite understand exactly why all of that was the case, I was seeing those sort of differences. And I think that's something you get, right? When you're walking across the whole country, you get that view across sort of the whole country, really, or at least the sort of slice of it that you're walking through. And so you can sort of see those differences. And I think especially when I did it on my own, so you had a lot of time to start thinking and to sort of pondering on the sort of different things I was seeing, and especially those anomalies in the landscape and in the path network.
And what about the history of these paths? I've seen I've walked myself, and everybody will have probably walked on a few, and you see the signs as you travel in your car, public footpath. Two questions really. What's the history of them? How did they come about? And secondly, we're obviously speaking from England. Are they the same England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland and around the world, or is there anything unique about what we've got in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where they came about, I think one of the fascinating things about our path network is that in the vast majority of cases, it's unplanned. It's not, there are some instances of things like enclosure and there's some instances where whole path networks were planned and sort of set down, and but in most cases, our path network has arisen through usage. It's people have needed to go from their home to the fields or to the pub or to church or to market or maybe even further afield. And so the sort of the sort of law and highways law is quite old and storied, but essentially those legal rights to pass and repass, which is what you sort of have on a public right of way, have built up because of that sort of constant usage by people. And I think that's, for me, that's something really special, because it is like you are sort of walking in the footsteps of thousands, if not millions, of people that have come before you on that path over generations. And I mean, some of the paths, and one of the ones I write about in my book is one of the paths I write about in the book is a place called the Dorsetshire Gap, which is a sort of amazing meeting of 5 or 6 paths, and it's one of these amazing holloways that have been worn down by sort of millennia of feet and hooves that have been going through there. And that is a prehistoric path. That is a path, because of you can tell from the landscape it sits in, and also from that wear over time, that this is a path that was literally used by, people 2,000-3,000 years ago for pretty much the same reason I'm walking it. I mean, maybe the motivations behind the walk were different, but they're doing the same sort of action. They're walking through. And one of the things I love about our sort of path history or thinking about our path network is the way I see it is they're the oldest part of our heritage that are still in use for what they originally were in the first place. Like you see sort of maybe, something like Stonehenge, it has a different use, it has a different context now. And the same with some like Iron Age hill forts, they're not defensive anymore. But some of our oldest churches are, beautiful, but they're many, many years younger than some of these paths. And so literally, me walking along this path is sort of doing exactly the same actions as those who have come before. But to sort of after that sort of rambling answer on your second question, I think one of the interesting things, again, with that sort of built up over usage thing, is that in England and Wales we have a public rights of way network, and that's the way that that primarily access to natural landscapes in the countryside, but also towns and cities is sort of formulated, and we've got 140,000 miles of those public rights of way, and so that is a massively extensive network that does sort of connect between and in most communities across the country. In Scotland, there's a different approach to public access. They have what's often called the right to roam, technically called the sort of right of responsible access, where you have a broader number of places you can go, but less defined paths, which is amazing in some ways, can bring issues in some ways, because, there's a certainty that comes from public rights of way. So, it's sort of different views on that. But then you go to places like, Northern Ireland is I haven't, to be honest, I haven't been walking myself there, but talking to people, public access is just so minimal there. You don't have really any ability or very limited ability to access the countryside. And I think certainly the differences between England and Wales and Scotland, I think the reason why we've ended up with some of these different legal systems is because of those different landscapes. England and Wales is, for the large part, has always been highly populated in different, and populations have changed over time. You go to somewhere like Lincolnshire that used to be one of the most populated parts of England, and now it's, the opposite. But you've always had that dense population of people that, again, that's where I think those constant repetition of usage of paths have then created that legal right and sort of defined them in the landscape. So I think that's where some of these differences come from, because obviously in Scotland you have, maybe except for the Central Belt and some other population centres, you've got whole large areas of land which is unenclosed and open, and so you have a different sort of conception of how you access that land.
And what about the rest of Europe? I know they've got long distance trails like the Camino, and other ways. And the States, does it work differently over there? Do they have their own little public footpaths?
Yeah, there's some parts of Europe. Again, it's sort of similar, maybe in some ways similar landscapes to Scotland. You have that generalised right to roam, particularly in some of the Scandinavian countries. And then when you get to more sort of, I suppose, Western Europe and Southern Europe, they have different approaches, different legal systems. We have a very sort of rights-based, legalistic approach to public rights way, which for me is fantastic, because it means that they're very clear. You can see where they are. You also have options to make sure that they, to legally challenge them if they're being blocked, whereas quite a lot of Europe doesn't have that. And I think that is something really special about what we've got in England and Wales, because we have that network that is protected and is extensive. Even if you go further afield, there's a writer called Marion Shord, who's a fantastic writer about sort of land access, and she compares England and Wales to New Zealand, where there's quite a large parts that are relatively similar landscapes and climate. But public access in New Zealand is really restricted to some amazing but small number of like national trails or regional trails, and it isn't that sort of everyday extensive network. And I think that's the real special thing. We've got some amazing national trails in England and Wales, but it's that really ordinary network that goes between communities across the country that I think is something that we need to sort of treasure and celebrate.
While you were talking about that, and I was listening to what you're saying, I live in South Lincolnshire, but I think it's the same in the rest of the country. What I like about footpaths, yes, you can do the long ones, you can do the Pennine Way and the South Downs Way, and they're fantastic. But there's lots of little routes you can do. I've got a book where I've got an ordnance survey map. You can do a 6 or an 8 mile walk round with a couple of pubs.
Yeah.
And you can make a morning walk or an afternoon walk, go to lunch. And I think for any visitors to the UK, that would be a particular attraction, actually, and something quite unique.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing, I don't know if this would, well, hopefully for visitors as well, but also for people who live here, one thing that I always encourage people, there are some amazing guidebooks and websites. We are in a sort of golden age of information about where to go walking, which is fantastic. People sharing their inspiration and tips and experiences about different routes and places. But one thing I'd actually encourage all of your listeners to do is almost find a bit of the Ordnance Survey map that might not be that far from where you live, but you've never been before, and just look at what paths are there and sort of chart your own course and just go exploring. And that's what that network allows us to do. In a way, you can sort of make your own routes up on the ground as you go. And you might come across a path that's blocked, or you might make decisions as you're going walking. You can say, actually, I'm going to go left instead of right. I'm going to, you can almost sort of, because you've got that extensive network, you can sort of make your own routes along it on the ground, which I think, is something that I love doing. I can easily, where I'm in London, get the train out into sort of Kent or into Surrey, or even go sort of north of London and go to a random bit of the countryside, pick a random train station that I've never been to before, and then just go for a circular walk from there, and not necessarily knowing what I'm going to find, but just going exploring. And that's what that sort of having that sort of spider's web network allows you to do. You can sort of just create your own way through the landscape.
Design your own walk as you go.
Exactly.
What's the difference between a bridle way and a public bridle way and a public footpath? Because I noticed you mentioned, when we were talking about the walks, the footpaths in Dorset, you mentioned footsteps and hooves. Hooves obviously suggesting horses. Can horses go on footpaths, or is it just bridleways? Could you sort of clear that up? Because I'm a little bit, a little bit confused on that, Jack.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, essentially, they're all types of public rights of way. There are, and I'll be brief on this, but I think hopefully we'll clear it up. There are four sort of categories, really broad categories of public rights of way. There's a footpath, so that can only be used by people on foot. Although when I say that, it's worth saying that all of these, including footpaths, can be used by someone on a mobility, using a mobility aid as well. So there's footpaths, there's bridleways, which again you can use on foot, but also on horseback. Also cyclists as well can use bridleways. Then you've got restricted byways. They're all of the above, so on foot, on horseback, on cycle, but also if you happen to fancy it, you can take your horse and cart down there as well. So motorized vehicles can go down there. Obviously, you don't see many people going on horse. You do some people sort of trap riding and things like that, but you can take your horse and cart down there. And then you've got byways open to all traffic, which are essentially public roads that don't really look like roads, so they might not be sealed or tarmacked or anything like that, and they can be used by anyone, including on in a car or a motorbike sort of thing. So, but the most two common really ones are footpaths and bridleways. But yeah, so it's an amazing network with some sort of nuances in there in terms of who can use what.
I've done walks before where the footpath goes across a field at a diagonal, and you find that some farmers are very good. They've actually, even if you've got crops that are a couple of meters high, they've actually put the tracks through. They've clearly defined it. They've put a tractor, they've cut it or whatever, so you can walk through. Others, you're left scratching your head, sort of seeing where that footpath goes. Yeah. Is that a common thing, or is it is it just my experience of it, or does that happen all the time?
No, it is. It is definitely. It is a common issue, and I think it is an issue. So when you've got a public right of way, so any footpath, right of way, etc., going through a field, the landowner should leave a clearly defined, wide enough. It's not exactly. There's no exact science to how wide enough, but two people should be able to pass each other easily on a footpath. They should leave that path clear. Now they can put a nice polite sign saying we'd prefer you to walk around the edge, but and if you would like to, you can do that. That's almost like they create an additional permissive path around the edge, but they should leave that clear way across. And I think it can be a significant issue because I mean, you said you're from southern Lincolnshire. There are parts of the country where these fields are massive, right? And so actually, like, having to sort of skirt your way sometimes sort of slightly difficult in a difficult manner around the sort of edge of the field where there's the edge of the ploughing and things like that can be really challenging. But also if that path is not going through that field, it's the right of way has been taken away from its historical line. And actually, I think, for me, that's one of the sort of points that I'm getting, hopefully getting across in my book and talking about it is that that it isn't just a practical way. These paths aren't just a practical way to access the countryside, which they are, and that's amazing for that. But actually, the pattern of them, the way they run, where they go from and to, is part of the historical. It's part of the history of that path, and so that path does need to be clear through a crop. I mean, a landowner can apply for a public right of way to be diverted, for instance, and at the Ramblers, we are a statutory consultee to any diversion. So our volunteers will look through that and decide whether to oppose or not. And maybe if it's a small diversion around the edge of a small field and, the going is not too bad underfoot, they won't object. But if there's a diversion that takes you really far out the way, makes it much less convenient, but also makes it much less enjoyable. So, we've got quite a few examples where we've successfully opposed diversions because they're taking you away from a path that has really nice views and that is sort of really nature rich into somewhere, diverting it somewhere much less so, much sort of less enjoyable for the public. So they can be diverted. But if there is a public right of way that still runs across that field, it should be nice and clear for everyone to see and for everyone to be able to use.
It's interesting that you were talking about diversions. Here in South Lincolnshire, we have quite a few gravel pits. And there was one just down the road from me where they put a diversion in, and the diversion was there probably for about 4 years. And it was actually a really nice walk because it circumnavigated the gravel pit and went into a little forest, and everybody got used to it. The dogs were walking there and all that sort of thing. And then when it had been finished, the original footpath was reopened and that one was closed, which was really sad, really. After the village had actually put up with all the dust from the gravel pit and everything, but people still use it. That's the amusing thing.
Yeah, I mean,
nobody's stopping them. So,
well, exactly, and actually, it's an interesting thing, and maybe I don't want to give this away too much if that landowner's listening, but hopefully that would be unlikely. But if the public continue to use that path for 20 years, then that will become a public right of way as well. And now you can apply to get that recorded as a public right of way because of that. If they got continual usage and there's no sign saying don't use it, or, people aren't like climbing over gates and things like that, then it will become a public right of way. And that's, going back to the history of a path network, that's how most of them came in the first place, that there was just continual usage that then sort of, created a public right of way. So might end up with a situation where you've got a couple of different options on that path network in a few years' time, which would be amazing.
Well, I've got another example here, and this is, and I would suggest it's probably not unique to where I live, but we've got quite a few farms around, as we discussed, and there's one particular farmer where they have, it's not classed as a permissive footpath because it's only been here for about 3 years, but they've actually allowed people, because they knew people were doing it, they've actually allowed people to walk along the edge of a field to link up a road and a footpath, which was never a footpath before, which is very nice of them.
It's great when individual landowners, businesses, allow permissive additional access. Obviously, that can be withdrawn. I'm not saying it will be anytime soon or anything, but I think it can be withdrawn. It's worth saying that if the landowner said, "I'm allowing you to walk here with permission," then the use of that path at that time doesn't create a public right of way, because otherwise no landowners will.
And that's what it says.
Sort of thing,
exactly. And that's what it says. It says it can be withdrawn at any time, and that we want you to enjoy it, but please keep your dogs on a lead and all this stuff.
Yeah, so exactly. And also some landowners will do that It sounds like that's just a sort of very altruistic thing. A lot of landowners also are walkers and enjoy the countryside, and also, as you said, they've got rural businesses and things like that. And so, there's a sort of advantage having more people out in those spaces. But also some landowners will have permissive paths because they would prefer you to use the permissive paths for whatever reason. Maybe it goes away from the farmyard buildings, and people don't have to use permissive paths, but often I know quite a few walkers, myself included, who sort of prefer to be walking in the fields rather than through the middle of the farmyard, for instance. As long as that landowner is not stopping you go through the middle of the farmyard and just encouraging you elsewhere, that's absolutely fine. And I think it's a pragmatic approach to that sort of situation.
In terms of the actual ownership of the footpath, who owns the footpath and who's responsible for maintaining it?
Yeah, so one thing the first thing to say is, as we've sort of, I suppose, implied through the conversation, and this is something that, again, when you're talking to maybe like visitors from somewhere like America, is sort of slightly blows their mind, but probably 95% plus of our public rights of way are over private land. So these are a public right to be on someone else's land, on private land. Obviously, a lot of that's farmland, but also woodland and lots of other different types of land ownership, and a lot of on places like like Forestry Commission land and National Trust land and things like that, even MOD land as well. But yeah, so the vast majority of public rights of way are over private land, and in terms of the sort of ownership and responsibilities, a lot of that comes out of, in a way, it's all about sort of compromise between those different needs, and public rights of way as a whole are sort of, in a way, a compromise, and I think a sort of good compromise between the ability of a landowner to manage their land and the public to be able to access the countryside and wider natural spaces. So when it comes down to it, landowners have a responsibility for any sort of furniture or any potential, so things like gates and stiles, they have a responsibility for them, and that's because those are there for their benefit and not for the public's benefit. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have any of those, because they, make walking harder, and especially things like stiles can be a big barrier to accessibility of the countryside. But they're there for the management of the land, and so they have to be. They can only be there with permission from the local authority. So now many of those have been there for many, many years and were given permission sort of from the very beginning. And so, they're responsible to make sure that they're in good working order. A gate can open, is not locked, the stile's not broken, etc. Landowners are also responsible for ensuring that the path isn't blocked by, and this is where you get a little bit technical, but hopefully interesting, the path isn't blocked by sort of vegetation that comes from the side. So if you've got like big hedges and or even trees that fall down and block the path, the landowner is responsible for ensuring that that vegetation comes from the side, isn't obstructing that path at all. And then the local authority are responsible for the surface of the path. So if you have vegetation coming from below, from the actual surface of the path, or the path is, particularly badly eroded in some way, then the local authority are responsible for that surface of the path. So it's a little bit of a mixture between the landowner and the local authority, and and obviously we know that most public rights of way aren't like actually surfaced, and that's a good thing probably, that they're not ribbons of tarmac through the countryside. But and most of the surface is kept clear from vegetation by people using a path. Ultimately, that's the best way of making sure it's open. But obviously we do need landowners to make sure that trees that fall down on paths or big, hedges and things like that don't encroach on paths, or that gates aren't locked and stiles are sort of in good working order, etc.
Oh, well, thanks for clearing that up, Jack. Made that very clear. So if I was a landowner and I had so many hectares of land and I wanted to sell it, it's my land to sell.
Yeah,
but somebody has to be told, look, it's your land when you buy it, but there's a public right of way across,
exactly, and it will exist.
which you've got to make sure that, you've got to make sure you clear anything that falls on it, and we'll let the council get on, and the local authority can well, I wouldn't mow it, but
Exactly,
make sure that the surface
I mean,
is
it's worth
okay
saying
to walk
also
on.
that in
Right,
terms
okay.
of that maintenance, the Ramblers, we've got about 180 path maintenance teams that work, and because again that surface issue, in most cases, they're working with the local authority and they're sort of volunteering on behalf of the local authority to clear those paths. They also do work with landowners, and in some fantastic instances, I think there's a team in Buckinghamshire where they with working with the landowners and often people donating money, they've removed 350 stiles and replaced them with gates. So that is sort of helping the landowner in a way because it's a
For accessibility.
yeah, exactly.
To
For
help the accessibility, I guess.
Exactly. But the landowner gets a brand new shiny gate, but actually the public are the big real winners in that because for accessibility, and that's not just people in maybe using mobility aids, but it's everyone, right? It's much easier if you're not clambering over a stile, even if you're a fit person in your 30s or 40s or whatever. It's much easier going through gates rather than climbing over a stile every 30, 40 meters or whatever.
So tell us about the Ramblers. I mean, as far as I'm aware, they've been going a long time. They're a charity, aren't they, the Ramblers?
Yes, we are a charity. We have actually just at the beginning of this month in January 2025, we will just be coming into our 90th year. So we have been around for quite a long time. And we are an organisation, so we've got 100,000 members, but we're very much not just a sort of membership focused organisation. All the work I've done for the Ramblers over the last 7 years has always been about us as a charity and about that public benefit. So we have, as I said, we've got 100,000 members. We've got about 25,000 volunteers across the country who do an amazing range of things. So they lead walks for other members, but also importantly, in terms of a charity, we have teams of volunteers that again, because we're a statutory consultee to any change to the network, that will look at all of those changes. We've got volunteers that are like parish wardens that go out and check every path in their parish every 3 or 4 months or whatever. We've got path maintenance teams. We've got volunteers that support us taking legal action. We take about around 10 legal cases every year to protect the rights of the public, and then also we lobby for legislation and for changes to regulation and policy. I mean, most of the legislation, actually, pretty much certainly all of the post Second World War legislation that enables us to access the countryside. So the legislation that created the need for public rights of way to be recorded and protected, that created areas of open access land, that created the England Coast Path. All of those legislation has come about because of lobbying and behind the scenes work and campaigning from the Ramblers to make sure that more people can get out walking across the country in towns and cities out in the sort of wild countryside.
Yeah, I guess we've talked about the countryside, but I mean there are public footpaths in residential and town and city areas, aren't there?
There are, and I think some of those can be really important. They can be cut throughs across small areas of sort of woodland or scrubland and things like that. You get in some in the sort of suburbs and things like that, but also urban, very urbanized alleyways and things like that. And actually, when it's some of those paths that, if they're blocked, will make a real big difference. I mean, all paths will make a difference, but a real big difference to people's everyday lives, because the path, the alleyway could get developed on, for instance, if it's not protected as a public right of way, and that might have been the way that people got from their house to the shops or to the bus stop or something like that. And so
yes.
There's a whole network, and I think that's one of the things I love about that. I can go from the middle of inner city Manchester, say, and I can walk from there to Dorset on the same network, on the public rights of way and the highway network. And I think that's like an amazing thing that they're all part of one much bigger whole.
Yes. And what about walks along rivers and canals, towpaths? Are they considered to be public footpaths?
So there'll be a lot of public rights of way along rivers, although I mean, maybe one thing we'll get into is about some of the sort of threats to our path network and things like that. I mean, one thing it's worth noting, paths along some rivers is that, with a seemingly ever changing and more extreme climate, paths are getting eroded from riverbanks quite a lot. In terms of canal towpaths, most of them aren't actually formally designated as public rights of way. That's because each canal, back mostly in the 19th century, had a Act of Parliament, and the Act of Parliament actually specified that the towpath wouldn't become a public right of way. But the vast majority of canal towpaths are publicly accessible. A lot of the network is managed by the Canal and River Trusts, and they're very keen for people to be using the path network for walking and in some cases cycling. So it is publicly accessible, but it doesn't have that sort of maybe long-term protection and certainty that comes from being a public right of way.
Why is it so important that we protect our footpaths?
So I think there's sort of two real broad reasons. I think the first thing to say is that having a public footpath recorded as a public, have a path recorded as a public footpath or a public bridleway, etc., means that it's a very practical way of people being able to know where that path is. It should be on the Ordnance Survey map. It should be signposted. And it also should be clear. It should be unblocked. You should be able to use that path. So there's a real practical sense. There's a real practical reason why I think it's important to sort of protect these paths. It's also worth saying that it protects them to some extent from development. From being built on, from planning. Which isn't to say that I don't think we need any development, but it means that you have to take into account what you're going to do with that public right of way if you are, building some new houses or a railway line or something like that. And then the other reason, and this is really, I suppose, the heart of my book, The Lost Paths, is that these aren't just a practical way for us to access our amazing sort of green spaces and countryside. They are a part of our history. They are some of the longest surviving parts of our history. And I see protection as public rights of way as almost being up there with listing buildings or scheduling ancient monuments. Actually, it's protecting that history on foot or on horseback. And it's, I think, an often overlooked part of our history. It's not necessarily related to kings and queens and sort of grand occasions. It's working class history. It's about how ordinary people have interacted with their landscape over generations and generations. So I think there's a real importance to protecting it for that reason as well.
And if people want to get involved with either the Ramblers Association or they feel strongly that they want to protect footpaths, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of different ways you can get involved. In terms of the paths that are already recorded, there's loads of opportunities at the Ramblers, but also other organisations. Sometimes sort of parish councils have footpath groups and things like that, where you can get involved with, getting with actually sort of making sure that these paths are open and usable for people, whether that's physically clearing them on the ground or getting involved with lobbying councils and reporting issues on public rights of way. I mean, even if you don't want to volunteer, I think I definitely urge anyone that if they come across a problem on a public right of way, if they come across a locked gate or a blocked path in any way, to report that to the local council. We know that councils have budgetary issues, let's just say. That's probably putting it mildly at the moment. But the more reports they get of these problems, the more they will deal with them, even if it's not necessarily the next day. So I think I'd urge people to do that. But also, we have, I talked earlier, we've got 140,000 miles of public rights of way in England and Wales, but there's potentially over 49,000 miles of paths that are not recorded, that are not protected in any way. And the Ramblers have got a project called Don't Use Your Way, which is about getting volunteers and supporting volunteers to get those paths claimed and put back on the map. And it's I think, a really fascinating thing to be volunteering with, because essentially what you're doing is you're looking back at old maps, old records, parish records, old railway plans, tithe maps, enclosure maps, loads of different evidence, and you're building up a picture of the usage of that path over time, and basically demonstrating that path was used by the public in the past, and therefore it should be able to be used by the public now and be recorded as a public right of way. And people can get involved by that by if you just search for Don't Use Your Way and the Ramblers, then you can look at that map of potential lost rights of way, almost 50,000 miles across England and Wales, but also, even more importantly, get involved in helping protect them and get them back on the map.
Yeah, it sounds like a really interesting, almost a hobby, actually. So I'd heard that there was a time limit of something like 2030. Otherwise, if we didn't sort of define these public rights of way, these ancient public rights of way, they would just disappear forever. But what's happened with that?
Yeah, so there was a deadline introduced to record all these public rights of way. That deadline was introduced in legislation in 2000 and set the deadline as the 1st of January 2036. The thinking behind that was, it was a bit of a compromise, and I have to admit, one that the Ramblers weren't massively happy with, but it was enabling landowners to have some certainty about where public rights of way were on their land. And so the thinking at the time was, we'll give 25 years to get all these paths claimed and to get them put back on the map. Now, when that came in, the government at the time, in a very sort of late 90s, early 2000s way, said, we'll do it. We'll put loads of money behind it and make sure that these paths all the paths that can be claimed will be claimed and be found and be put back on the map. That money didn't really materialise. So that's where charities like the Ramblers and others like the British Horse Society, Open Spaces Society and others are stepping up to get those paths claimed. That deadline of 2026, the last government announced that they were going to delay that date to 2031. So that delay was put into legislation. I think partly because they, through the research the Ramblers have done, just saw the size of the issue here. This is, as I said, almost 50,000 miles of public rights of way that could be claimed or might be able to be claimed. But in sort of fantastic news, we've been lobbying for that deadline to be removed entirely, because even with any deadline, paths will be lost that could have been saved. And these are, as I've been saying, a fundamental part of our history, but also our future in terms of how we want to access our countryside. And our towns and cities. But in fantastic news, on Boxing Day, actually, it was the best Christmas present I got this year. Not that I didn't get some lovely presents as well, if many of my friends or family are listening. But the government announced that they were going to scrap that deadline entirely. So it's a really fantastic news. Now,
wow.
We're yet to see that in legislation, but it will be, when it actually is completely confirmed in legislation, it will be a fantastic step forward for making sure these paths are able to be saved long into the future.
So if we've got any listeners in the UK who live in a particular area and they think, actually, I really do want to try, I do a bit of walking. I know where my footpaths are, but there could be others. They could get in touch with the Ramblers Association and somebody would put them in touch with somebody more local who could sort of give them a bit of a steer in terms of how they would get going on that, would they? Yeah,
in most parts of the country, we've got coordinators, not in all parts of the country. If someone wants to volunteer as a coordinator, that's great as well, where we've got gaps, but we've got coordinators that are helping local volunteers to do this work. We also run training courses in conjunction with the British Horse Society, who are also very active in this area, for people to training them in how to do these applications. I mean, applications aren't, I don't want to put people off, but they aren't quick, because you are looking at loads of different historical sources and interpreting them. An application might draw from 10 to 20 different sources and then really build up that picture of public use over time. But they're really interesting, because you are sort of really diving into the history of that particular path and that landscape. I think in a fascinating way, looking at some beautiful old maps and records, but also not just doing that for your own satisfaction and enjoyment, but actually you're leaving a real long-lasting legacy when you put an application in, and when it's successful, these paths will be there for generations, hundreds of years to come, and that's, there's not many things you can sort of say that you do that will necessarily last that amount of time. So it's I think it's a fascinating thing to get involved with, and we welcome everyone and anyone who wants to get involved with this. You don't have to be a Ramblers member or have to be involved with the Ramblers in any way at all before. If you're keen to get involved with that, we're here to support you and to get you up and running to save some more of these paths.
I've got two questions, just sort of going back a little bit on something that's struck my mind. Two questions. One's on lost paths and one's on the council. If there is an issue, should people talk to their parish council or county council?
Yeah, so they should talk to the county council, or if you live in in some places you might live in like a metropolitan borough or somewhere like that sort of thing. But essentially, they should talk to the what's called for these purposes the Highway Authority, but that's usually the county council or the unitary council. You can actually, if you're not quite sure, we have a map on our website, on the Ramblers website. If you just sort of search for report a problem map Ramblers, something like that, you'll find a map and it will tell you exactly what council should be contacted. It also gives links to the best way of contacting the council to report an issue. Some of them have online portals where you can report something. Some of them just have an email address, etc. But we've sort of looked through all of their websites and got links directly to those. So, and we do urge people to report things, because the more issues they get reported, the higher this sort of rises up the agenda in the council.
Tell us about your book, The Lost Paths, and how that came about.
Yeah, so I think as I was working for the Ramblers, and my initial role there was to set up this Don't Lose Your Way project. So really focused on these historical paths and saving them, and how we through where people have walked and ridden over generations. And also, not just and that's in terms of how these paths were originally created, or sort of how they were sort of solidified through usage. So in the book, I write about drovers routes that go across the country, big long drovers routes from the Highlands of Scotland to places like London and York and Manchester, but also how paths were created through things like the trade in salt. So there's a whole network of saltways in the West Midlands and around some of our coastal places, and things like the creation of the coastal path that goes around much of the country. But also, it's called The Lost Paths, and I also wanted to write about how paths had been transformed or indeed entirely lost, and some of which can be saved and put back on the map. And hopefully, I want people to be inspired to get involved with that through it. But, some of them might be lost forever. And so, a couple of examples of that are, there are paths that were lost through the coming of things like the railways. As the railways were sort of slicing up the countryside, they were going over those old patterns of movement. And, it's interesting with the railways. At the same time, they enabled lots more people to get out into the countryside for the first time, especially sort of pre-beaching cuts with all these rural railway stations. They're also a massive enabler of people going exploring the countryside. But I also write about where we've lost paths in, off the coast of Britain. The eastern coast of England is the fastest eroding coastline in Europe. And so we are losing, paths. We have lost whole communities, whole towns have been sort of lost under the sea. And there's quite a lot been written about those, but maybe not about all the paths that connected them and the streets that have been lost, sort of, with those towns. But also things like when Britain was sort of preparing for potential invasion in the Second World War, obviously it was a sort of emergency situation, and many paths were disrupted and closed. So new planting could be made, dig for victory, etc. But also things like anti-tank ditches and also particularly airfields. One magazine at the end of the Second World War described Britain as one big aircraft carrier floating off the northwest coast of Europe. We had airfields that covered land about the same size as modern Bedfordshire. Massive area of land and all those paths were disrupted, and quite a few of them were put back after the war, but not all of them. And so there's all of these different forces, and I think hopefully from when I'm sort of just giving a few of those examples from the book, you can see how, again, I think we can tell the history and so many different facets of our sort of nation, our island's history through its impact on the path network and through where people have walked and ridden across the country.
How did you do the research to find out about, say, the salt routes?
Yeah, I mean,
is that something that you did is that something you? Sorry, is that something you did as you were doing your walk, or was that subsequent to it?
No, I mean, it was subsequent, really. Once I'd sort of decided that I wanted to write the book and someone decided they'd like to publish it, I started thinking about all these different forces and different ways that our paths have been created or impacted. And then, and then just started, doing some research into those different areas. I mean, one of the fascinating things to me is that, and this is why I just loved writing the book and researching it so much, is I get to go down so many different sort of little side routes and little alleyways into our sort of nation's history, and discovered that so many people have, in small ways and in local ways and particular angles have been also fascinated by our path. So, there's amazing, quite a lot of Victorian sort of antiquarians are quite interested in the paths. I mean, they had a particular fascination with sort of Roman roads and Saxon paths and things like that. But also loads of people, local historians have done research just on that, on their local parish about all of the paths and roads and how they were sort of used over time. And so there's just a wealth of material out there, and local newspaper reports and the old maps themselves and things like that, that just had so many different sort of inspiration and so many different sort of routes for me to go down. And then, once I sort of thought, actually, this is a place where I can find some of these old paths that are either there still or could be lost, then I sort of set out into the countryside and in the towns and cities to find them and describe what I found when I walked them. And it isn't just a straight history, so to speak. It isn't just a sort of a sort of academic or potentially sort of dry history. Hopefully, it's probably about half the book is my first-hand sort of account of what it's like to walk these paths and what I found there and what I could see there. And so hopefully people sort of enjoy that mixture of the history, but also, I suppose, sort of almost sort of nature and travel writing, I suppose, and social history, as you say, that can be found on the ground in just going for a walk.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation, Jack. Where can people find out more about you and your work and the book?
Sure, yeah. So I've got a website. It's Jack F, that's F for Freddie, Cornish, .com, and you can. It's obviously got all the links to buy the book. It's coming out in paperback in April, so people can pre-order that now, or still get the hardback, or even if they'd like, they can listen to me for 11 and a half hours. I think it is, reading the audiobook. But also, it's got. I think last year in 2024, I did about 24 different talks for the book across the country, and I'm hoping there'll be many more of those to come. So there's a page of different events where people can come and hear more about these paths and see some of the photographs of them and just have some chats about the book and about the paths. So lots more to come in 2025.
My guest today has been Jack Cornish. Jack is head of the Ramblers Association, responsible for walks, and he has a new book out, The Lost Paths, details of which will be on the show notes. Thanks for coming on the show, Jack.
Thanks very much. That was fantastic. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope all your listeners enjoy it too.
been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I will be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.